All right, everyone, I want to welcome you. This is Katrina VanHuss with Turnkey, and thank you for joining us. We do a regular series of C-suite directed webinars, and the one today is with two special guests who have lived through nonprofit mergers, in fact, have even instigated nonprofit mergers. So we're still waiting for one of our panelists to come on, but I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We know that he is trying to get phoned in. He's already online with us. So I will jump right in. So I am Katrina VanHuss. Today I have with me Michael Sapienza, who is the CEO of the Colon Cancer Alliance, and also John Lehr, CEO of the Parkinson Foundation. I won't try to introduce further because these guys will tell you a lot about themselves in the course of talking about their various experiences with merging nonprofits. So we'll jump right in. And these two executives made one thing clear to me as I interviewed them about bringing nonprofits together, and that is that doing it is messy business. But that the synergies of doing this endeavor of bringing together two nonprofits pointed at the same mission, the messiness of it and the pain of it is far less than the productive outcome that it brings. The first thing we'll do is get into the general detail of these mergers, how they came about, and then we'll dig into the details of how it feels. And then lastly, we will go into the details of what it produced.
Katrina, by the way, I'm on.
Oh, hello, John. How are you? Well, since you're here, let's let you both say hello. John Lehr, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
And Michael Sapienza, same for you. I've had the pleasure of working with Michael for a long time, and I really appreciate you joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Katrina.
Excellent. This conversation is sort of interesting. I have another good friend who works at JDRF who did her master's work on the proliferation of nonprofits. And so, that conversation was 4 or 5 years ago. And since then, it's come up again and again. And when you think about the proliferation of nonprofits, and what that may imply in terms of redundant overhead, the answer to that in my world or in my mind is the merger. So I was very excited to find that these guys had that in common and could talk meaningfully about it. So Michael, we're going to start with you, if that's okay. And I'm going to get you to go sort of start to finish. If you could tell the story of your mom and start there and then go through till how you became CEO of Colon Cancer Alliance.
Absolutely, Katrina. So my mom was, I think, around 55 years old when she was diagnosed with colorectal cancer. I was a professional musician living in none other than Miami Beach, very relevant this week. I've been thinking about the folks down there for sure. Living a block from the ocean at that time. So playing with an orchestra called the New World Symphony, and my parents had called me and said, Michael, we have a little bump in the road. And, for them, that was a little bit odd. Normally I had one of them on the phone, not both of them, and I knew something was wrong. And my mom said I'd, been diagnosed with colorectal cancer. Fast forward a couple of years, unfortunately, she passed away on Mother's Day in 2009 from the disease. And about a month before she died, my brother had said to me, Michael, you seem very distracted. You're not really into your music. What's going on? Why, what would you do if you had $1 million? And I said, you know what? I would start a colon cancer foundation. Well, I didn't have $1 million. We got our family and friends together and we started an organization called the Christopher Life Colon Cancer Foundation. That organization grew in 4 or 5 years to be the second largest advocacy organization in our space here in the United States. Really from the onset of that, I had this vision of, all right, when we first started, you look at colorectal cancer as the second leading cause of cancer-related deaths in the United States for men and women combined. And the largest advocacy organization at that time had a budget of about $1.2 million. So the vision had to be, how do we make a bigger impact? How can we be an organization that is, taking this disease by its horns and creating a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society or a Susan G. Komen or somebody that is having a huge impact on research, et cetera, in our space. And, one of those things was looking at our competitors. quote unquote, right? And, I think that's a good word for us to use in the nonprofit space because, people think, oh, well, you're doing something good. There's no competition. Well, that couldn't be, I think, further from the truth. There is a lot of competition. And so one of the things that I did right off the bat was say about 4 or 5 years in, who could we potentially merge with? How can we work together? How could we partner? And what I will say is probably about a year before we actually merged with Colon Cancer Alliance, we started having conversations, and those conversations were started by yours truly. So I did start this conversation. And it took us about a year. And Katrina, I don't know if you want me to talk through all of that now, or if you want me to do that at a later point. But there, as Katrina said earlier, there definitely was a lot of strife, et cetera, during that year. But what we kept front and center was always kind of what you're seeing on this screen. All of these different words, and it's all programs. It's programs, impact. Together we're more. How, and every meeting, no matter what kind of meeting it was, that's what we started with. And so I became the CEO of the organization when we officially legally merged on January 1st of last year, 2016.
I think that is fascinating to hear you talk about keeping the mission front and center, because every successful business runs that way. Every successful organization runs that way. And yet you started it before you were one organization. I think that speaks well for the future for you. Thank you for that. Now, John, your experience is a little bit different. In my head, you've done 3 mergers, but technically I know one was not. So in the course of talking about these 3 instances, could you also give us a little bit of background? We know Michael came into the nonprofit space from being a professional musician, which I take as corroboration that math and music are closely attached, But if you, John, could tell us a little bit about your background before you started this whole journey.
Sure. I mean, I was in a band when I was in college, but nobody wanted to pay us to play. So I'll just put that out there. So my professional background is that I have been in the nonprofit space my entire professional career, with the exception of 2 years at a consulting firm. And I started at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania system, working in development, really working in grant writing, corporate and foundation grant writing. And then I progressed up to major giving. I worked at cystic fibrosis for a number of years and ran a $175 million major giving campaign, which was interesting because we did it in the voluntary healthcare space, which hadn't really been done quite like that. And then I moved over into the management side. Katrina, as you say, I have now been part of 2 mergers. One at Food Allergy Research and Education, or FAIR, and the other one at Parkinson's Foundation. At FAIR, I took 2 smaller legacy organizations, one based in Washington, D.C., and one based in New York, with similar goals but different programs. And I have just come on board at Parkinson's 8 months ago, doing a similar thing, 2 smaller legacy organizations into one national organization. The 2 legacy organizations in this case were, again, New York, based in New York, and in Miami. So I've been in the nonprofit space, first as a fundraiser, more on the management side in the last number of years. So that's my background.
Very good. Now, Cure Search, define how that's different from the mergers for our audience.
Yeah, so Cure Search is interesting because it's a children's cancer organization that was founded when the National Cancer Institute said we want there was a whole series of consortia out there focused on children's cancer that the NCI was funding. And they said, we want to have one consortium that ended up being the Children's Oncology Group, and one organization that was responsible for managing that consortium and doing additional things in fundraising and advocacy. And so Cure Search was that, and I came in, a number of years after the consolidation of the consortia, but was really charged with continuing to figure out how to optimize that structure.
Very good. All right, so now let's get into, how do things start? When you think about two organizations coming together, Michael, you answer the question, who reaches out first, and maybe what does that mean? So Michael, can you talk a little bit more about, as the two organizations came together, how did that happen? What were some of the stumbling blocks? What were some of the things that made it work well?
Sure. So I think the first is, I did touch on earlier that it was kind of my idea to initiate these conversations, but I think more importantly, it was the excitement that both myself and the board chair of Colon Cancer Alliance felt together, right? There wasn't the exterior bits of all the BS, let's say, and really it was just us talking about, wow, look at this, look, we could do this, we could do that, we could, this is the impact we could have. So I'm just reiterating that how powerful that piece is. And it was, for that first year, in terms of before we actually merged, it was like dating.
Yeah.
It absolutely was. There was the fear on both sides, I think, of rejection. And then at times it's like, one ego had to roar its head, and then the other had to roar its head to make sure that these, the powers were aligned. And I think one of the first things that we did after we talked about vision and goals and where we're going from a mission standpoint was the non-starters of each organization. And we really did that separately. So we had each organization put those non-starters together and then put them, actually together, as a merged organization. And we said, okay, so for Colon Cancer Alliance, what's your non-starter? For Chris for Life, what's your non-starter? And for us, for CCA, it was, they wanted to keep the name. And for Chris for Life, it was that they wanted me to be the CEO of the organization. There was a couple other, more minor things, but those were kind of the two big pieces. And we kind of went through that, over the course of, I don't know, let's say 4, 5, 6 months. And I remember at one point, we were bringing the updates to the full board of Chris for Life at the time. And one of the board members started crying and just said, Chris for Life, that's your mom. How could you give that name up? I don't understand. This is something that you guys have, poured blood, sweat, and tears into, and et cetera. And so I stood up and I said, well, first of all, my mom would be hiding under this board table if she knew that there was an organization named after her. And then the second was my dad stood up actually and was like, this is what Chris would have wanted. This is why, Chris maybe is looking down on us and would be excited, right? The whole point of what we are all sitting here to do is to have more impact for patients and families. And it was such an incredible moment for the full board. I mean, obviously it's, Chris's husband, so that has impact into itself, but it also told a different story, which is we are bigger together. And these little petty things, and I hate to call them petty because they're really not, they are things that you have to move through emotionally, et cetera. But it really definitely, was an impactful piece of, how we kind of move forward.
That's very powerful. Your father, that was a great gift that he gave that group. So John, same question, the two biggies, who gets to be in charge and whose name do we use? How did it happen at FAIR?
Yeah, so it's interesting, in both FAIR and the Parkinson Foundation, these were board-directed mergers that actually occurred, were in process before I came along. So at Food Allergy, or FAIR, the two boards, what happened, the opportunity that presented itself was there was one of the founders of the organization stepped down, and I think that cleared the way for board members to have, on both sides of the equation, to have a conversation about ways that they could bring their complementary mission programs together. And so when I came on board in Food Allergy, it was April of 2012, and the merger agreement was still being fine-tuned, but both sides had agreed that they wanted to have a new CEO come in to run the new organization. And there was an executive director and a CEO, and both of them understood that they would have a role within the organization, but they would not be the CEO. And so I came in and I oversaw the finalization of the merger agreement, and then some of the more intricate details of the integration. And then we were on our way to knitting the organization together. At at Parkinson's, again, the opportunities presented themselves was there was a departure of one CEO and the retirement of another CEO, spurred on by some outside competition in the Parkinson space from Michael J. Fox.
Mm-hmm.
And so these two smaller organizations that had been kind of competing with each other for 60 years finally thought, this doesn't make a lot of sense. We've got an opening here. Let's come together. Let's merge. Our missions are complementary. The merger legally had occurred before I arrived, but the board agreed that they were going to take the next 6 months, find a CEO, not make any big decisions about how to integrate the two organizations until the CEO came on board, and then really give the CEO the opportunity to think about what best to do in terms of programs, operations, philanthropy, et cetera.
How long from when you took the chair until your first plan was delivered about what you were going to do? What was that span of time?
So in food allergy, it was about 5 months.
Mm-hmm.
In Parkinson's, we're just about to go into our formal strategic planning process.
Mm-hmm.
But to be clear, I started pulling my senior leadership team and members of the board together about 3 months in.
Okay.
But we will deliver a full strategic plan to the board here at Parkinson's in mid-January. So essentially 1 year to the date of my arrival.
Okay, very good. You're getting to be a bit of a specialist, aren't you?
I've done it twice, so
well,
I'm not sure too many people have done it in the nonprofit space. So I've learned a lot. I have to say that. Sure.
Well, I think I hold most of the expertise in the industry on doing this on this phone call right now. So, my hope is that it inspires some people to do same. So, John, one of the situations that you talked about with Parkinson's, you mentioned the Michael J. Fox Foundation, that it really contributed to your decision-making and to that group's decision-making. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so, the Parkinson's space, so there's about 1 million Americans who have Parkinson's disease. And the two legacy organizations that I merged were both founded coincidentally in 1957. And I would say that there were about a handful of what could argue that they were truly national organizations, and then a lot of smaller regional-based Parkinson's foundations. When Michael J. Fox came out publicly that he had Parkinson's back in the late 1990s, and then decided to open up his own foundation, he did so because he thought that none of the national organizations were focused on drug discovery and development, looking for a cure. And I think Michael J. Fox thought that he, because of his celebrity, could bring a lot of resources to bear and really focus on that one issue. He did not set out to duplicate the services of the other two organizations. I think he really carved out a niche. And I think that was enormously beneficial to the Parkinson's community, because I think it was a shot in the arm that all of the national organizations needed to be better, be more responsive to the Parkinson's community. I think it was also good because he decided to, not duplicate, but really to focus on an area that was not being covered. And what it also demonstrated was that you could raise a lot of money. People with Parkinson's were very interested in finding solutions for their problems. And it made the two legacy organizations start talking to each other, the two that are now one, start talking to each other and putting aside past grievances or disputes and thinking about, okay, well, we're both doing certain things. We could probably do them a lot better, more efficiently as one organization. And there's probably room for Michael J. Fox and another really big Parkinson's Foundation out there.
Very good. Now, it's my impression of the Parkinson's community that even with this merger, it's still a fairly fragmented community. Is that accurate, or am I making things up?
No, I think that's a good way to look at it. It's fragmented in the sense that there's consolidation going on among what we could argue are the national organizations. I mean, so right now there's about 4 organizations that are still covering the country nationally. And then there's a lot of these smaller regional organizations. The smaller regional organizations are much more focused on local service delivery, helping people with Parkinson's at the community level, whereas Fox and Parkinson's Foundation and the 2 other organizations beyond that are also investing heavily in research, that's basic translational and clinical research. And frankly, you just need to have a lot more resources to be able to play in those games. And so there's a small number of those organizations, but a lot of other organizations. And I can say that the regional service delivery organizations are aligned with us in some formal and informal collaboration. So we're talking to them a lot. We interact with them a lot. But there's, I think, further consolidation that can happen in the space for sure.
Very good. Michael, I know that when you were on Match.com for nonprofits, you were looking at a variety of potential partners. Are there others that maybe would be candidates for future mergers?
Yeah, I think this part of the conversation is really interesting because, I think patients and their families don't necessarily care which organization it is from a nonprofit standpoint that they're getting help from. It just matters whether they're getting help. Yeah. And I think, if we all keep that in mind, now granted, of course, we're a business and, we have to abide by what our strategic plan says and what our business models are, et cetera. But I think we as nonprofit leaders really have to keep that in mind that, John Smith does not care whether it's Colon Cancer Alliance, Parkinson Foundation, it doesn't matter. And so, to answer your question directly, Katrina, yes, there are a lot of other organizations. We are a fairly fractured space as well. And I still see, at least from my opinion, and I think our board and patients and families perspective, that we need more of a unified voice than even that we have now with the combining of CRISPR Life and Colon Cancer Alliance. So, we're continuing to have conversations. Maybe it's just dating now, but hopefully potentially, a marriage in the future.
Love it. So let's get into now you've decided to tie the knot. Michael, I thought the CRISPR Life versus CCA cultures, as you described them, sounded like a big messy thing to bring into one house. Can you talk about that?
And can I just tell you, this picture scares me. I feel like I have PTSD now, like to the actual merger. I mean, the dog is so cute, and then I'm not sure what's on the other side, but
I think it's a cat. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Is it a cat? Is it a cat or like a wolf or something? Anyway, so I do think that this culture piece is really important. It's something that, for me, coming from a musical background, playing in orchestras around the country, and then being in a nonprofit background, I was very entrepreneurial. I kind of was fly by my pants. I had a ton of ideas, creative, et cetera. And the Colon Cancer Alliance, Oldco, was very association-like. There was a lot of kind of infrastructure that had been built, very academic, but not a lot of, wonderful creative ideas. And when we brought each other together, it really was, especially with having me as the CEO, there was a lot of clashes. And the way that I kind of equated to is, I'm going to go back to my musical analogies for a moment, is when you play in an orchestra, you have a conductor. And so, John and I probably would be seen as like the conductors of, these different organizations. And the job of the conductor is to take the bassoon and the violin or the tuba and the flute and make them actually sound good together, right? And so that's bringing two cultures together. And the flute and the violinist, they've never performed before, they've never been together before. It's going to be, there's going to be some storming in there. And I'll give one example of kind of the way it was for me. So, in the office, I was used to bringing in donors and bringing in patients and families into the office all the time. And during the first 2 or 3 months of the merger, I did that. And there was this huge backlash from employees. Oh my gosh, Michael's coming into my office with a patient or with a donor, et cetera. And I'm like, I didn't have patience for it, of course, right? I'm like, what are you talking about? These are the people that matter most to us. But it's a very, very simple thing that, of course, I had to understand. All right, well, they just hadn't done that before. It really had been an office. There was no interaction, no grassroots kind of efforts, et cetera. So I think really looking at, you can kind of see it in this picture. It's like looking at a lens from either side, and time, in my opinion, from what we went through in terms of the cultural differences, was the most important piece of it. And we bended both ways, right? It wasn't just like, all right, the whole organization is now going to be entrepreneurial, right? Because that may not be the way to go. It was flexible both ways.
Wow, that's a great analogy with the orchestra. People are very different, but they got to sound good together. I love that. John, I am sure that you have had similar experiences. Can you share?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Michael's analogy for the conductor is spot on. I often refer to myself as, in these situations as a quarterback or a conductor. I think both of those work where you've got team members who are very valuable, but you've got to have somebody who's at least kind of, calling the shots and pulling it all together and making sure that everybody's working harmoniously. In both of the merger situations that I was involved in, it was interesting because you had drastically different cultures, on both sides of the equation. In food allergy, I had one organization that considered themselves to be research, scientists, evidence-based, and the other organization was, we're the grassroots organization. We're in touch with what's going on the ground. And they were both very prideful, rightly so, in what they did, but they also were a little skeptical of what the other side was doing. That actually plays itself out a little bit in the Parkinson side. Again, one focused much more on research and the other one being more of a grassroots organization. So bringing the culture together is something that I work on with my leadership team all the time. We're talking about culture a lot. And we have the added burden here of having leadership team based in Miami and leadership team based in New York. Because when the board came about, when the board merged, they didn't want either organization to feel subordinate to the other. So part of my role is going back and forth between Miami and New York, but also making sure that the leadership team, who are still here, are going back and forth to Miami. So it's in New York. It's a bit of a tricky thing. But I think it's worth spending a lot of time on. It's fair because our culture was so different, and we had a little bit of staff turnover, which is very natural, I think, in these types of mergers. People think, you know what, I'm not up for this. I want to move on. And so you have a chance to bring in some new people, but you have to knit them into the existing as well. So in one case, I actually brought in a firm here in New York that are business psychologists, and they did some really nice work. We didn't do a Myers-Briggs, but we did something similar. The idea was to understand how we each worked and, what the composition of the team was. Somebody was very focused on their individual, whereas somebody else liked to bring in and have a lot of consensus. So we were trying to understand that so that we could work most effectively as a team.
That's fantastic. What do you think the degree of difficulty having the two offices, one in Miami, one in New York, what degree of difficulty did that impose as compared to the other way that you did it with everyone in one office?
So, in the first situation, the board said to me, John, you choose where you want this organization. And I was living in Washington, D.C., so it was a pretty easy choice. So I kept the organization in Washington, D.C. as the headquarters. We did keep an office open in New York, and it was an important office, and I had one member of the leadership team there. In this situation where I'm going back and forth, the burden really is falling on me, and I'm up for that. That's what I signed up for. I would say long-term, it's going to be a challenge because you do want to be able to pull your leadership team together. Technology helps in that. Zoom, just like we're doing now, is very effective. But sometimes you need to bring your leadership team together and kind of look at each other in the eye and solve problems like that. So I think over the long term, we'll probably have to reevaluate, should the leadership team be in one location altogether, or is it okay to keep doing it this way? I think I would say I'm leaning toward, let's pull the whole leadership team in, let's have the leadership team in one place.
Got it. Very good. All right. So now let's talk about the boards of the two organizations. And John, I'm going to ask you first, what have you found specific to the boards is the best way to bring them together?
Yeah, so in food allergy, what I did was when we formally merged, we had a board meeting of the collective, the new board, and I brought in a consultant, and what we did was we talked about, let's make sure that we're achieving consensus, that we're rowing in the same direction. We did a road mapping exercise. One of the key questions we needed to resolve initially was, okay, we have limited resources, we're trying to do certain things. What is the spend, research versus education and care and advocacy do we want to have? And So at that very first meeting, led by the facilitator, we came up with a formula of 75% for research funding and 25% for education and advocacy. And, again, I think, and we all bought into that, and that was a very good, clear indicator to me and the leadership team about how we were going to use our programs, go about our program spend and budgeting. I would say that in Parkinson's, it's remarkable in both situations. The boards, I've said this in both situations. If I brought in somebody from the outside and asked them to try to pick out who was on the one side and who was on the other side, in both circumstances, immediately those things fall apart. The boards came together, I would say, more quickly than the staff. I think that's probably because they're less in the trenches, less directly involved, and really taking a much broader view. And so I think I was actually pleasantly surprised in both instances that the boards were able to consolidate and align around the new organization.
Nice. And Michael, I'm imagining you nodding your head because this goes back to what you talked about earlier, keeping the mission front and center as you went through this consolidation.
Yeah. The one thing that I would add is it's interesting, John. So we actually were the opposite. Our board took way longer to get rid of the us versus them than the staff did. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think one of the reasons was because our board, the old co-CCA board, did not have term limits. And so there were people that had been there for 15 years or more, right? And so there was a little bit more entrenched in culture. I hope none of them are listening, but folks that were entrenched in culture. Yeah.
So I want to acknowledge we've got a couple of questions and they fit nicely into some upcoming segments. So folks, I will ask them at the right time. So let's move forward. Regrets, when you look back at, I'll go with you, Michael, first. When you look back, are there things you wish you'd done differently, things you wish you'd said differently? What do you think?
It's a hard question. And, I think I told you that I wish I knew what I didn't know. And it's really hard. I mean, I try not to be hard on myself. There were a couple times last year where, I wanted to hang in the towel. And I think, I look at where we are now, like in 2016, we're about $1.3 million ahead. And now this year, we're about 40% ahead of where we were last year. So, I wish I would have known it could have happened faster and would there have been less turnover, et cetera. But I think overall, I don't have regrets, except that I wish I would have known some things earlier and could have learned faster.
Mm-hmm. So specific to turnover, in year one of the merger, what was your percent turnover?
I think it was about 35 to 40%. And, John, you alluded to this. Some of that I think is totally natural via a merger, whether it's people just don't fit in and, are looking for a different opportunity. Potentially they were unhappy before. And then I think others was initiated by myself, whether or other team members, in terms of what is the direction from a strategic standpoint, where are we going, and do these folks, do their skill sets align? And we're seeing much less turnover this year, so that is a good sign.
If everyone performed well, would the merger have created instances where you just still had to let someone go because of the redundant roles?
Yes, but we actually did most of that prior to the merger. We had one or two opportunities actually last year to reduce duplicity, and we did do that. So there was both times prior to the actual legal merger date and afterwards. Yeah, now that I think about it, that we did that. Yes.
Very good. And John, how about you? Any regrets when you look back over the years of doing this, things you wish you'd done differently or will do differently next time?
Yeah, I think I pushed too hard and too fast at food allergy. I was eager to make things happen quickly and to demonstrate progress. And I will say one of the things I learned from that, and I really have implemented here, is to build in the expectations of bumps along the road. You know, when you're integrating an organization programmatically, operationally, philanthropically, communication-wise, new brands and new everything. You know, people want things to go super smoothly, but there's a lot of complexity to what we're doing, and you know, we're a 100-person employee, coast-to-coast organization, and so you know, I would always say, look, folks, we're going to implement a new phone system, but you know, if your phone doesn't work, please just, you know, let's make sure that we bubble that up to the people who can take care of that, and we'll get on it as quickly as possible. So I think building in those expectations that it's not going to be smooth as glass, that there are going to be bumps in the road, that we're going to try and address them as quickly as we possibly can, was a really big lesson learned for me. And I will say that in terms of turnover at Food Allergy, I had considerable turnover, and I've had virtually no turnover here at Parkinson's. I will also say that, you know, the Parkinson's team was really terrific, so I wasn't looking for a lot of turnover, particularly at the senior leadership level. But it did require me, because we had some duplication of talent and skill set, to repurpose a few folks, which required a little bit of adjustment. In fact, I just got out of a meeting earlier today where I was having a really, you know, good but you know, difficult conversation about splitting some jobs and moving people into new areas. So that I think is an inevitable thing in these types of mergers.
Very good. So we've talked about, you know, how it maybe feels to the organization, but what about you yourselves? Michael, you know, you've told me about some particularly difficult conversations, and it sounded to me like you were saying, and I changed because of this. Can you tell us all about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all as leaders strive to continue to be as relevant as possible, continue to be visionaries, continue to be, you know, on the forefront of both, you know, the managerial part of what we're doing, but also on, you know, where is the organization and the space going, and how do we work with our boards, and, you know, keeping track of, you know, all the different things as leaders we need to do. And so, I mean, I took that and take that very seriously. I think I also felt like a lot of the tug and pull, us versus them, during 2016. And there was a point where I was in a meeting with actually staff members, and I got very defensive, which it was just kind of like, what are you doing, Michael? Why are you getting defensive? You'd never get defensive. And I think I was feeling like I wasn't being heard, and our board chair was like, all right, you need to come up to Philadelphia and let's sit down. And he said, Michael, I don't trust you.
Wow.
And it was incredible. I mean, I have not been told that probably since, like, maybe I was in like 10th grade in high school and I snuck out of the basement of my house or something. You know what I mean? I hadn't been told that. I was like flabbergasted. Like, what is there not to trust? I mean, you know, and I actually turned back to him, and it was really, I felt very proud of myself, but also being able to grow in that opportunity. And I said, well, you know what? I don't trust you either. Meaning it was like this huge awakening for both of us, I think, that we were actually part of leading the us versus them problem, both from the board standpoint and from the CEO managerial standpoint. And for me, it was a huge place of growth. I mean, from that meeting on, really things kind of started getting better. I mean, there were some other tug and pulls as we continued, but it was an incredible, you know, learning experience in placing trust in people, and then allowing them to place trust in you too.
Wow, that's a great story. John, have you had similar experiences?
Yeah, you know, I think when I came into Parkinson's, the thing I was determined to do differently than when I came into Food Allergy and then into Cure Search was, and you know, I did a listening tour in all three places. But this time around, I really was very intent, how do I say it? I was listening with greater intent, and I was asking questions, and I was realizing that as CEO, I've, you know, now done this 3 times, there's only so much that you can have true expertise over. You know, I know I have pretty good expertise in major giving. I'm pretty good at translating complex research things into into good lay language, but I'm not a communications expert. I'm not a educational content expert. So I have to make sure that I have the very best team around me and to ask them questions about what do you think is the best way to go? What do you think we should be doing? And to really listen and rely on them and let them lead their own areas of expertise. In fact, earlier today I was saying, as we are doing some of our reorganization in our fundraising program, I said, we have many different revenue streams, and I want each person who's in charge of the revenue stream to consider themselves to be essentially the CEO of that business unit. They'll have their goals. We want to make sure that we're hearing from them on resources, but we want to give them the room and the latitude to grow. And I think that idea of we're not, it's not a boss, supervisor, director, relationship thing, but rather a collegial thing where we're working on this. It's this thing that we're all responsible for, and that we each have roles and responsibilities for very specific things. We've got to knit it all together. That's part of my role. But I'm really all about now empowering people, giving them the room to run, letting them feel like they have a lot of responsibility in their own areas for decision making. And I think that's making a huge difference in how we go about this integration as opposed to the one I did before.
That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I love your CEO of your business unit analogy, and it brought to mind I had a staff person this morning at Turnkey complaining because the chief development officer of their client organization was editing copy. And as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, yes. I'm not crazy. That's not good. That's not good.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. All right.
Exactly.
Yeah. I am just a funny aside. I actually had the CEO of a top 20 healthcare related nonprofit ask for an embroidery sew out once. And I thought, oh my God, we will never cure X because of this, so I really appreciate your commentary. Okay, so this is the fun part of the story. What happened then? And I'm going to ask one of the questions that came in. And Michael, I'm going to go to you first so you can answer the question and talk about what happened with you guys at the same time. The question is, did you guys or your walk/fundraising event directors notice any changes in your peer-to-peer fundraising events after the mergers? Any backlash or negative feedback from pre-merger fundraising participants? And were they less aligned post-merger? So, Michael, as you tell us what happened at Colon Cancer Alliance, if you could hit those questions as well.
Sure. So I do think in general, when we merged, we were understaffed in our development and peer-to-peer fundraising element. We were very much centralized in terms of we were running our run walk series. We didn't have volunteers on the ground, at least let's say a lot of engagement of volunteers on the ground. And we weren't necessarily aligned in that when we first merged. And I would say now we are getting alignment in that. We are launching a DIY program. We are launching, looking to figure out potentially even another event series outside of that for pipeline and continued growth. And it did take a long time. And I think, it took us 6-9 months for the team, both the VP for development, director of special events, et cetera, to get aligned in that piece because, we're moving strategy and you're also implementing day-to-day strategy. So it's a lot of stress on the team, and I'm also saying, all right, we got to meet these numbers, but, those sorts of things. But, you look at it, the reason why we merged was because 1 + 1, equal 2. And, I look at it, like I said before, 6 months down the road, we were at a 3, and 9 months down the road, we were at a 4. We are continuing to grow, by leaps and bounds. We just started a new prevention foundation in Philly, and continue to do very, very, very well.
And Michael, tell me, when after the merger was the moment when you looked around and you took a breath and had a sigh of relief and went, it's going to be okay. This is going to work. Yeah,
so this is a hard story for me to tell, so I apologize now if I get upset. But so Blue Hope Ash is our annual fundraiser. Last year it was at the Fairmont in Washington, D.C. The year before we had raised about $500,000, and we went into this event already above $500,000. So we had already, hit the goal going into the event. I think we raised around $800,000 or $900,000, and really the team kind of came together to celebrate around that. And I hate to say this, but unfortunately at the very end of the night, after we were all so jubilant about literally doubling the amount of money that we raised, one of our staff members died.
Oh,
He was supposed to be at the event with his parents, and he died. That day, had a heart attack at 37 years old.
oh,
And I will tell you, it was, speaking of fast tracking cultures, fast tracking anything that are differences in your organization, we all came together in a room, literally almost the entire staff, at least the staff that was in Washington, D.C. And, you know, it was unlike anything I had experienced, really. And it totally changed the direction of the us versus them. We were us. We were absolutely us from that moment on. We, in terms of attending the funeral, we have, 40, 50 people on staff, et cetera. Almost every single one of them were at the funeral, even those that don't live in Washington, D.C. So it was definitely a turning point for us.
wow, that's a wonderful story, and great sadness brought some good things out of it.
Yep.
John, what did your 1 + 1 equal?
So it was really interesting because at both Fair and at Parkinson's, our first year as a merged entity were the best financial years for both organizations in their histories. Which, yeah, and I attribute that in the case of Fair to just the energy that we brought from the post-merger. Some really great people that we brought in from the outside, including my chief development officer, the person we talked about before, Katrina, and just a lot of energy around that. And, thinking about the business in a different way. And the good news was people bought in. I mean, there's a little bit of resistance to some of the things that we did, particularly in our walk program, but we were imposing best practices, and it resulted just in an increase in our revenue. The increase in our revenue this year at Parkinson's Foundation is a little worrisome to me, frankly.
Yeah.
Because we really did have a great year, and it's more because of it's less. The revenue streams that did so well this year are the ones that we don't control as directly. For example, our bequests and estates. We just had an amazing year in our bequests and estates. And so what I've done is I've staffed up in our major giving. We are expanding our walk program. I'm very confident that we'll get a return on the investments we're making, but I think it'll be a little longer before those show. So it's probably more of a FY19 event than a FY18 event. So what I'm trying to do is just make sure that we hold steady state this year and grow where we can. But when you have a blockbuster year in your first year, it's great, but it does raise a lot of expectations for how you're going to do. And not that we're not up to those expectations, but if it were areas that we directly controlled, I would feel more confident. But because it's in areas that we don't directly control, it just gives me a little bit more angst.
Got it. Okay, we have a couple of questions here. First question is, and I'll pose it to both of you, what makes a great candidate if you are shopping nonprofits with which to merge? So, John?
So if you're asking, for a candidate organization, I would say an organization that, is probably aligned with you, but maybe more complementary in terms of the programs and services they provide. I think it also is good if they're, I'm a strong believer in mergers in the nonprofit space for greater efficiency, and most importantly, because I think it's what the community wants. I think Michael's point earlier about most people they just want to make sure that work is being done on their behalf. And so I think if you've got a candidate out there that's interested in merging with you, their financials look good, their programs are strong, and they're impactful, then I would enter into those conversations, sooner rather than later.
Any flaming red flares that say run away?
Just if their financials are off, or if they've, if there's any whiff of like fraud or that they're coming to you because they're in desperate straits. But if they're a strong, reputable organization that's, maintaining their 990 and you can see that their numbers are good, then I would enter in. But those would be the only reasons why I'd be overly concerned.
And the same question to you, Michael. What makes a great candidate? If you're thinking about expanding in this manner, what do you look for?
I mean, I think John really hit it. I don't think there's one size fits all formula for this. I do think there is a piece of, the partnerships that sometimes organizations that do the same things merge. Oftentimes, organizations that don't do the same things merge. So, I would look for, a lot of the things that John said. And, the other thing that I would say is that the process itself of merging. So from the time you have that first conversation to getting to that legal signing of the merger agreement, that's the hardest part, right? So, I'm happy to be open. I'm sure John would talk. Others, organizations like the Gilda's Club and Cancer Support Community, those that have had successful mergers, they are few and far between, actually. I think it's something like I don't know if you know the number, John, but I think it's 75% of them or 80% of them fail. So it is really important to look at what is that structure? How do you systematically go through that process of actually getting from, okay, I have a candidate, to actually signing that document?
I didn't know that statistic. That's fascinating. Do you recall what the primary reason for failure is?
I don't.
What would you guess?
Egos. I don't know, John, if you have a thought, but that's one of
them.
No,
I think you're right, Michael. I think it often comes down to egos. And I will say I attribute, I say this in public crowds when my chair is around and the other person who's on the other side. I said they get a lot of credit because they set their egos aside. People have to give things up in a merger, and some people benefit, but some people take a lesser role. And so for those people who can set their egos aside, my hat's off to them. But a lot of times that's not possible.
Yep.
Wow. All right. So, gentlemen, I am going to ask a question for my chair right now. One of the elements of priorities in my own strategic plan is to identify strategic partners who might eventually become part of Turnkey. I know approximately how much time I should be devoting to that effort. Is that same sort of thing, finding new potential partners to merge with, part of each of your strategic plans? And if so, how much time do you try to devote to that effort?
Michael, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I can go first. So the board, has talked to us about this, and I feel strongly. I think I mentioned before, we're still in a fractured space. So I do still spend, I don't know how to put a time amount on, but let's say 10% of my time, and not just thinking about mergers, but partnerships, because that's the first step. Sometimes we're talking about dating/partnerships. Those are the first steps. And so, yeah, I would say absolutely. I think in our space, it's crucial. We need to end this disease, and we're stronger together. So, yeah.
And John?
Yeah, I would echo exactly what Michael said. I think you're right. I think I spend probably about 10% of my time thinking about it. There are some clear, if you looked at, I'm not going to mention any names, but if you looked at our space, you would say, okay, I could see that down the road, maybe this organization and that organization would want to start having conversations. So we're definitely thinking about it from a strategic perspective. And again, I come back to, I think it's what the community wants. I've heard this from the community, not just, anecdotally, but more than just anecdotally. And I think Michael's point is a really good one. There are mergers, and then there are ways to get to mergers through collaborations, through partnerships. And, if you're in a program space, there's ways to involve other organizations programmatically so that you're working on the same thing. And then you get to know them, and some of the suspicions and fears start to drop. And advocacy is always an easy place because you're not really talking about money. You're talking about, policy or the federal government's money. So it's sometimes an easy place to start to forge those relationships. But I think talking to the people who are out in the space, getting rid of those suspicions, and talking about ways that you can partner on different projects is really a great way to go forward. We're doing that with a number of the organizations that are in our space right now.
That is fantastic. And actually, you two both hit the last question I had, which is philosophically, what's the argument for the merger, and what's the argument to not go start a new nonprofit because you got angry at a board meeting or whatever, and I think you hit that. You said the community expects this of us, to be an efficient conduit of funds to the mission.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Michael, any thoughts on that?
No, the only last thing I would add to what John was saying is, besides mergers and partnerships, there are other legal ways of working together. So whether we're talking about a supporting organization, like you were saying, around policy or advocacy, et cetera, and those are things that we're actually looking at too. So I do think, besides a full merger or a full acquisition or just a partnership, there's things in between too that could work for your organization as well.
Yes. All right. Any parting thoughts, gentlemen, about the merger situation? Are both of you open for questions if someone wants to address you privately?
I absolutely am. Yes. My closing thought would be that, I think the nonprofit space, I think a lot of people want to have value and feel like they can have value. And I think there are often existing organizations where you can be valuable and have impact. And so I would always caution people, this was really the case in the children's cancer world more than anything else, is that, and I understand why a child would die and somebody would want to create a foundation in their memory. But there's a lot of energy that goes into that and a lot of expense. And there are great organizations out there that they could work with without taking on that administrative expense. And I would just encourage people to do that before they go out and open another foundation.
Yeah. And Michael, any thoughts?
Yeah, Katrina, and I would take it, kind of maybe on the other emotional side, which is I remember when we started, there wasn't somebody that was taking the bull by its horns and doing something. So I think it is incumbent upon us as leaders of nonprofits. One of the things we're looking at is to be the leader. So when somebody passes away from colorectal cancer or has Parkinson's disease, et cetera, we have the services, the support system, the research, et cetera, so they don't want to start a new organization.
Got it. Got it. So as part of our mission being there, I guess that's also in a sense delivering on the mission if you're helping people grieve in an efficient way.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. It's been helpful for me personally as a leader, and I hope for the other people on the call. I thank you both so much. And I am sure I will find an excuse to interview you again because you're really good at this. All right.
Thank you, Katrina. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina.
All right.
Thanks,
folks.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Folks, thank you for joining us. You will be receiving an email with a recording that you can pass along or use yourself, and we'll also send you notice of our next webinar. Thanks so much for spending your afternoon with us. Have a good day.